I'm a night nurse. The hospital's rules are terrifying. The first time I stepped into St. Helena's Hospital for my night shift, something felt off. The air was unnaturally cold, even for a hospital. The fluorescent lights flickered intermittently, and the silence wasn't the usual calm of a late-hour facility. It was too quiet, like the building itself was holding its breath. I had worked in hospitals before, but there was something about this place that made my skin crawl. It was an old building, its walls thick with history, and as I walked through the dimly lit corridors, I swore I could hear whispers, so faint they could be mistaken for the hum of the ventilation system. When I reached the nurse's station, a thin, pale woman greeted me. She had dark circles under her eyes, like she hadn't slept in weeks. Her name tag read Margaret. "You must be the new night nurse," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I nodded. "Yeah, I'm Claire. First shift tonight." Margaret sighed, then slid a worn-out booklet across the counter toward me. "Read this carefully. And for God's sake, follow the rules." I frowned and picked up the booklet. It wasn't a typical employee handbook. The pages were yellowed, the ink slightly smudged. The first line sent a chill down my spine. Failure to comply with these rules may result in immediate and irreversible consequences. I let out a nervous chuckle. "Is this a joke?" Margaret didn't laugh. Instead, she grabbed my wrist, her grip surprisingly strong. "Do break them." Her intensity unsettled me, but I forced a smile and opened the booklet. The rules of the night shift at St. Helena's Hospital. 1. Never enter room 616. Does not exist. If you see a door labeled 616, ignore it and walk away. 2. At exactly 2:33 a.m., you will hear a knock at the supply closet. Do not open it no matter what you hear. 3. If you see an unfamiliar patient wandering the halls, do not approach them. Do not speak to them. Look away and keep walking. 4. The intercom will occasionally announce a code black. This is not meant for you. Ignore it. 5. Under no circumstances should you look outside the windows between 3:15 a.m. and 3:45 a.m. Close the blinds if necessary. 6. If a patient in room 302 starts whispering, do not listen. Plug your ears and leave immediately. 7. At exactly 4:44 a.m., you will feel someone standing behind you. Do not turn around. I laughed nervously. This has to be some kind of initiation prank, right? Margaret didn't smile. Instead, she exhaled sharply and checked the clock. "You should get started. You'll want to be prepared before 2:33. I felt a pit form in my stomach, but I pushed it aside. It was probably some weird hospital superstition. I tucked the booklet into my pocket and grabbed my clipboard. How bad could it be? The first rule. The night started normally. Rounds, checking vitals, administering medication. The patients were mostly asleep, their steady breathing the only sound accompanying the rhythmic beeping of heart monitors. At around 1:45 a.m., I walked past a long hallway I hadn't noticed before. The walls were slightly darker here, the lights dimmer, and at the very end there was a door. A door labeled Room 616. My stomach clenched. My mind immediately recalled the first rule. Room 616 does not exist. But it was there, right in front of me. Curiosity battled against reason. My hand twitched at my side. The urge to turn the handle was overwhelming, like the door itself was calling to me. Then from behind me a voice. "You shouldn't be here." I turned sharply. Margaret stood a few feet away, her face paler than before. Her eyes were wide, darting between me and the door. "It's real," I whispered. Margaret grabbed my arm, her fingers ice cold. "You saw wrong. Come with me. Now." I hesitated, but something in her expression, pure, unfiltered terror, made me follow her back to the nurse's station. "You're lucky," she muttered. "Some people don't get a warning before it's too late." I wanted to ask what she meant, but before I could, a sound echoed down the hallway. Faint rhythmic knocking. Check the clock. 2:33 a.m. The second rule. The supply closet was just around the corner. The knocking continued. 3 steady knocks, then silence. Then 3 more knocks. I gripped the counter, my nails digging into the wood. "Ignore it," Margaret whispered, eyes fixed on the floor. The knocks grew louder, more insistent, and then a voice, soft and pleading. "Please help me." A woman's voice, muffled like she was trapped inside. My pulse spiked. "Someone's in there." Margaret's expression darkened. "It's not a person." I swallowed hard, my throat dry. "But what if?" The voice changed. It deepened, warping into something unnatural. "Claire, open the door." My breath hitched. How did it know my name? Margaret reached out and covered my ears. "Close your eyes. Don't listen." I squeezed my eyes shut, heart hammering in my chest. The knocking became a pounding. The voice shifted, distorting between screams and laughter. Then suddenly silence. Margaret let go, exhaling deeply. "It's over." I slowly opened my eyes, my skin clammy with sweat. "Welcome to the night shift," Margaret whispered. I stared at the supply closet, my hands trembling. The shift had only just begun. And I was already terrified of what was to come. I didn't sleep after my shift ended. Couldn't. The knocks, the voice that called my name, the door labeled room 616, they all replayed in my mind like a twisted lullaby refusing to let me rest. I tried convincing myself it was exhaustion playing tricks on me, that I had imagined the voice morphing into something inhuman, but deep down I knew better. By the time I returned from my second shift, my hands were still shaking. Margaret was waiting at the nurse's station, her face as gaunt as before. She slid a cup of coffee toward me without a word. I took it, grateful, but my stomach churned too violently to drink. "You made it through your first night," she finally said. "Wasn't easy," I muttered. She exhaled, staring at the clock. "It only gets worse." The way she said it sent a shiver through me. I wanted to ask more, to demand answers, but the intercom crackled before I could. A monotone voice filled the hospital. "Code black. Code black." Margaret stiffened. I glanced at her, expecting some kind of explanation, but she wouldn't look at me. "The fourth rule," she whispered. "Ignore it." The intercom continued. "Code black. Code black. Staff, proceed accordingly." A whoosh sounded as the automatic doors at the end of the hallway slid open. A figure stepped through. Patient. Or at least, I thought it was. His hospital gown was soaked in something dark. His skin sallow, veins black like ink had seeped beneath his flesh. His head lolled to the side, eyes glassy and unfocused. He shuffled forward, one sluggish step at a time. "Who is that?" I whispered. Margaret grabbed my wrist, squeezing hard. "Don't look at him." But I couldn't tear my eyes away. The man's mouth opened. A slow, creaking motion like rusted hinges being pried apart. And then, a scream. Not just a scream, something wrong. It was a chorus of voices, layered over one another, shrill and guttural and deep, all at once. The lights flickered. The walls trembled. "Claire!" Margaret hissed. "Look away." I forced my gaze to the floor, heart hammering against my ribs. The screaming stopped. The footsteps shuffled past me. A silence stretched between us, suffocating and unnatural. "He's gone," Margaret whispered. I hesitated, then risked a glance toward the hallway. Me. Like nothing had ever been there. But I knew what I saw. I knew what I heard. Margaret turned to me, her eyes hollow. "Now do you understand?" I swallowed the lump in my throat. This wasn't just a hospital. It was something else. Third rule. My hands still trembled as I made my rounds. The tension in the air clung to me like a second skin. Every shadow seemed deeper, every sound more ominous. And then, I saw him. A man in a hospital gown standing at the end of the hallway, staring at the floor. He didn't move. Didn't blink. He wasn't on my patient list. A chill crept down my spine. If you see an unfamiliar patient wandering the halls, do not approach them. Do not speak to them. Look away and keep walking. My pulse pounded in my ears. Just walk away. I forced my feet to move. One step. Then another. But as I passed him, his head snapped upward. His eyes solid black. You don't belong here. I sucked in a sharp breath. His voice was layered like 1,000 echoes trapped in his throat. I squeezed my eyes shut, desperate to block him out. Leave, he whispered. Then silence. I forced myself to look. He was gone. The hallway stretched empty before me, as if he had never been there at all. I stumbled back to the nurse's station, my breath ragged. Margaret looked up. You saw one, didn't you? I nodded, unable to speak. She sighed, rubbing her temples. They notice you now. What does that mean? Managed. She hesitated. It means you need to be careful. More than before. I gripped the counter. Margaret, please. Just tell me what's going on here. She stared at me for a long moment. Then finally, St. Helena's isn't a normal hospital, she said. It's a doorway. A doorway to what? I whispered. Margaret's expression darkened. Somewhere we don't belong. A chill wrapped around me like a cold hand on my spine. I was starting to think I had made a terrible mistake taking this job. And I feared that soon, very soon, I'd find out exactly why. I should have quit. Every rational part of me screamed to walk out those doors and never look back. But I couldn't. Something about this place held me here. Not just fear, not just curiosity. It was like an invisible thread had woven itself around me, tying me to St. Helena's. And then there was Margaret. She knew more than she was telling me. That much was clear. But every time I pressed, she deflected. Avoided. I needed answers. But first I had to survive another shift. The fifth rule. Margaret's warning echoed in my mind as I prepared for my rounds. More than before. The things in this hospital had noticed me. And once they saw you, they didn't forget. The shift was uneventful at first. Patients sleeping, machines beeping. The mundane rhythm of hospital life. But as I approached a patient's room, I felt it. Change in the air. The temperature dropped so suddenly that my breath curled in mist before me. The fluorescent lights dimmed, flickering erratically. And then, the hallway window creaked open. The night outside was ink black, starless. The wind howled, carrying whispers that didn't belong to this world. My heart slammed against my ribs. Under no circumstances should you look outside the windows between 3:15 a.m. and 3:45 a.m. I squeezed my eyes shut. A presence loomed beyond the glass. I could feel it, watching, waiting. Something tapped against the window. Light at first, then harder. Then a steady, insistent knock, knock, knock. I clenched my fists, forcing my feet to move. Ignore it, ignore it, ignore it. The whispers grew louder. A chorus of voices, slithering into my ears. Claire, look at us. I bit my lip hard enough to taste blood. The air pressed against my back like something was leaning over me. Look. Bolted. I sprinted down the hallway, my breath ragged, my heart hammering. The whispers chased me, curling through the air, but I refused to listen, refused to look. The second I turned the corner, everything stopped. The warmth returned. The lights flickered back to life. The whispers vanished. The window was closed. Like nothing had ever happened. But I knew the truth. Something out there wanted me to see it. And I had barely resisted. The sixth rule broken. Margaret was gone when I returned to the nurse's station. I sat down, my entire body trembling. Sound. Of faint whispers. My stomach dropped. I turned toward the hallway. Room 302. The whispers were coming from inside. If a patient in room 302 starts whispering, do not listen. Plug your ears and leave immediately. I knew the rule. I should have left. But something about the whispers, low and rhythmic, almost melodic, drew me forward. I crept toward the door, pulse hammering. I shouldn't be here. I shouldn't be listening. The whispers shifted. One voice rose above the rest. Claire, I know you hear me. My entire body locked up. How did it know my name? I pressed my hands to my ears, stumbling back. The door creaked open. Darkness spilled out like ink, pooling at my feet. The whispers surged, twisting into something more, laughter. Something moved inside the room. I turned to run. But a hand shot out of the darkness, grabbing my wrist. Cold, wet, fingers digging into my skin. I screamed, yanking myself free. The door slammed shut. The whispers stopped. I staggered back, clutching my wrist. My skin burned where it had touched me. Something was inside that room. And now it knew me. You made a mistake. Margaret returned minutes later, her face pale. You heard them, didn't you? She asked. I nodded, unable to speak. She exhaled sharply, rubbing her temples. They know you now. I swallowed hard. What happens now? Margaret hesitated. Then she lifted my wrist. The skin where the thing had grabbed me. Black veins were spreading beneath the surface. A sick, crawling sensation pulsed beneath my flesh. Margaret's lips pressed into a thin line. You broke a rule, she whispered. And now, Claire, they won't let you. The black veins were spreading. Thin, spidery lines just beneath my skin, slithering outward from the spot where it had grabbed me. My wrist throbbed, a slow, deep ache pulsing in time with my heartbeat. Margaret didn't say anything at first. She just stared. Then, finally, we need to get that covered. She grabbed a roll of gauze from the supply cabinet, wrapping my wrist tightly. It won't stop it, she muttered, voice tight. But maybe it'll slow it down. Slow it down. I swallowed hard. What happens when it spreads? I whispered. Margaret didn't answer. The hospital wants you now. The rest of my shift was a blur. I couldn't focus on my rounds. Every patient's face blurred together, their voices muffled beneath the pounding in my skull. The hospital felt different now, its walls pressing in, its air heavy and thick. Like it was breathing. Like it was watching. I kept my wrist covered, but the ache never faded. Every so often, a strange tingling sensation crawled beneath my skin, like something moving. Like something waking up. Margaret wouldn't meet my eyes. I needed answers. So when my shift ended, instead of going home, I followed her. The basement. Margaret moved quickly, glancing over her shoulder as she led me down the back stairwell. The steps spiraled downward, deeper than I thought possible. The bottom door. Authorized personnel only. Margaret hesitated. Then she pulled out a key. The lock clicked open. And we stepped inside. The true purpose of St. Helena's. The basement was nothing like the hospital above. No sterile white walls, no bright fluorescent lights. It was cold, dark. The walls were lined with filing cabinets, hundreds of them stretching into the gloom. Some were rusted shut, others had chains wrapped around them. In the center of the room, a single desk. A lone lamp cast flickering shadows over the surface. Margaret rifled through the cabinets, muttering under her breath. Then she found it. She slid a thick folder onto the desk, flipping it open. My stomach turned. Inside. Rows of photographs. Nurses. Doctors. All of them standing exactly where I was now. All of them with black veins creeping beneath their skin. Some of them looked terrified, some looked blank. And none of them looked alive. What is this? Breathe. Margaret's voice was quiet. This hospital doesn't just treat patients, Claire. She turned the page. More photos. Some of them blurry, distorted. This place is a doorway, she continued. A bridge between our world and something else. She gestured to my wrist. And once they touch you, Claire, once they mark you. She didn't have to finish the sentence. Already knew. They wouldn't let me leave. The missing staff. I flipped through the pages. Some of the faces looked familiar. Then I stopped. My breath hitched. It was the man from the hallway. The one with solid black eyes who had told me, "You don't belong here." Below his photo a name. Henry Langston. Status, missing. Kept flipping. More names. More faces. Every single one labeled, missing. Where did they go? I whispered. Margaret's grip tightened on the table. They didn't leave, she said. They just changed. A chill crawled down my spine. I turned the last page. There. Blank space. But beneath it, my name was already written. Claire Thompson, status. Pending. The folder slipped from my hands. A sharp click echoed through the basement. A door had just locked. Something is here. The lights flickered. The air shifted. And then the whispers started. Not from outside the door. From inside the room. Margaret went rigid. Her eyes darted around the basement, her breath coming fast. They know we're here, she whispered. The whispers grew louder. I grabbed her wrist. We need to leave. The filing cabinets rattled. The lamp flickered. A low, crawling sound slithered across the floor. Something moved in the shadows. And then, voice. Familiar. Claire, you should have left. My blood turned to ice. Because the voice. It was mine. Would you like me to continue with part 5? The voice was mine. It slithered through the dark, curling around me like invisible hands. Claire, you should have left. Margaret's breath hitched. Her fingers dug into my arm, grounding me, but it wasn't enough to stop the thing inside the basement from coming closer. The whispers swelled, overlapping voices, crawling through the air like they had weight, like they were alive. And then, something stepped out of the shadows. Looked like me. First I thought it was a trick of the dim light. A reflection in the glass of a dusty cabinet. But it wasn't. It stood across the room, motionless. My face, my body, my uniform. But the eyes wrong. Hello, me. And yet, somehow, full of something ancient and hungry. The thing smiled. Claire, Margaret whispered. Don't move. I couldn't. The copy of me took a slow step forward. Its bare feet soundless on the concrete floor. I've been waiting, it murmured. I shook my head. My voice came out small. What are you? It tilted its head, considering. I'm what you'll become. The filing cabinets slammed open all at once. Papers exploded into the air like a flock of startled birds, scattering to the floor. Margaret grabbed my hand, yanking me back. Run. The hospital won't let me leave. We bolted for the door. The thing lunged. I felt its fingers brush my back, ice cold and wrong. A wave of nausea slammed into me, but I didn't stop running. Margaret fumbled with the key. The whispers screamed. The walls shook. The lock clicked. We stumbled through the door, slamming it shut behind us. Silence. No pounding fists. No footsteps. Like whatever was inside had let us go. Now. Margaret leaned against the wall, breathless. They won't let you leave, she said. Not until they have you. I clutched my wrist. The black veins were spreading faster now. I was running out of time. Breaking the rules. Then how do I stop it? Gasp. Margaret hesitated. You have to break the rules. I blinked. What? She grabbed my arm. You followed them. That's why they're winning. You have to break the rules, Claire. All of them. Flip their game upside down. Thought about it. The rules weren't for our protection. They were a trap. A way to condition us. to keep us playing by their rules until it was too late. I stood up. No more rules, I whispered. Final choice. The hospital was different now. The walls warped. The floors stretched. Reality rippled like a living thing, twisting around me. And then, the intercom crackled. Code black. Code black. The doors at the end of the hall slid open. A figure stepped through. The same man from before. The one with the black veins. The one who had told me, "You don't belong here." But this time I didn't look away. I stepped toward him. He smiled. "Good," he whispered. The hospital shuddered. The lights burst. And then, I was somewhere else. The other side. No walls. No ceiling. No hospital. Just darkness. And figures. Shifting shapes stretching in the void. Felt light. Weightless. And I understood. The hospital wasn't real. It was a prison. A cage for souls, keeping them trapped in an endless cycle of rules and fear. But I had broken the cycle. I had escaped. Now, I was free. Epilogue. I woke up in an empty parking lot. The hospital was gone. No building. No sign it had ever existed. Just a single name tag lying on the pavement. The black veins on my wrist. I was alive. And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. That I wasn't the same Claire who had walked into St. Helena's. That maybe, just maybe, part of me never left. Would you like an alternate ending or any modifications?